My name's Ian Roche. I'm the MD of Aurora. We are an operator based in the UK, exploring for oil and gas onshore in the UK. I guess in this context, we're the operator of a license in Lancashire and Merseyside, immediately south of the Cuadrilla acreage. We have drilled some conventional wells on our license to date. That was in 2012, and we will do further exploration in the future.
Good afternoon, Peter Stiles from Keele University. I started working on gas in various rocks in about the 1980s in Swansea University and transited through Liverpool eventually to Keele. What I specifically worked on was induced seismicity, mostly generated by coal mining. I've been working most recently, of course, on induced seismicity associated with hydrocarbons, not just in the UK, but in Italy and in Australia, and wrote the deck report on how we should address the seismicity which was experienced, quite unusually, it has to be said, in Blackpool with Cuadrilla. I have several lines of research going on, both theoretically and experimentally, on how fractures work underground and how they interact both with pre-existing faults and with things like aquifers.
Good afternoon, my name is Richard Graham. I'm principally an earth scientist. I started my career really in the offshore oil and gas industry in shallow seismics and geophysics. As a geophysicist, I've subsequently sort of retrained as a hydrogeologist, and, but still have a great interest in geophysics, particularly in this field as well. So I'm now working for RPS, multidisciplinary planning consultancy. I work very much in the environmental impact assessment side of the business, but have colleagues and interests in a wide variety of technical aspects of the shale gas industry through the sort of upstream and downstream. And very recently have participated in public inquiry for coal bed methane. So got a relatively new, I suppose, insight into some of the planning sort of events more recently in the UK.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Leon Jennings, Health, Safety, Security and Environment Director with Cuadrilla Resources. Obviously, the title suggests that things keep being added to my remit, security being the latest one about 3 weeks before Balcombe started, so really grateful for that. My experience with permitting starts with the sites in Lancashire, when the original programme was to fracture more of the sites that we'd already drilled after pre-salt. Through acquisition of the 3D data and reassessing that, we realised that there are other sites that we'd like to explore. So we withdrew the permits from the system, and we submitted permits then to explore down at Balcombe. Had 2 very successful audits from the Environment Agency through that process, and we're just about to submit planning and permit documentation for the 2 new exploration sites in Lancashire. So for the last sort of 18 months to 2 years, I've been living and breathing permits, planning and processes.
Thank you very much, Leon. I think that's quite a good segue. If I could just maybe address this question to you and Ian. From your perspective on the operator side, looking to pushing exploration forward, what's your experience really on the practical level of obtaining consents, both planning and all the other regulatory bits and pieces you need for your exploratory wells and your seismic, and working within the scope perhaps of some of the conditions that are placed upon those consents?
Okay, I mean, essentially the journey we've been on with planning and permitting has changed quite significantly really in the last 2 years. There was an obvious change in regulations in 2011 under the permitting, where more permits were required for the operations that we were doing. There was also a decision by the local authority to want environmental impact assessments for any wells that are hydraulically fractured. So even though we'd gone through the permitting process and submitted planning documents, there was a change in position from that to really look at things in a lot more detail from the local authority and Environment Agency. So we went through that journey of stopping the operations or slowing them down in order to comply and apply for these permits. Go through the system. Through that, we've built up a very good relationship with the regulators and the local authorities to a degree that they're becoming experts themselves in the industry, which is obviously fantastic. I mean, if you look at the remit of the original remit of kind of the Environment Agency and local county council, etc., it's a lot of kind of surface issues, looking at make sure there's no pollution, etc. But in order to regulate that properly, they have to understand the operation in order to understand how pollution could occur and what could go wrong in the operation. So we've had a fantastic relationship, like I say, the last couple of years to get to that stage, so that now we can submit permits, planning, etc., with confidence that they can go through and actually, if need to, pick any holes in that or any gaps that we've not identified and come back robustly and ask for those gaps to be filled. So it's not been a quick process by any means, and it's been quite a slow progress. The last well we fractured in 2011, we've not done a well since that. Just the short time we've been here today, there'll have been hundreds of wells completed in the USA. So it just goes to show the difference in the speed between the two. However, it is important here to get it absolutely right the first time. And for that to happen, there has to be a certain time period where regulators do sit down and understand the information that we're putting into the documents, challenges in the right areas, in order to duly make those permits, make sure they're happy with them, then go through the public consultation, answer all the questions that are relevant to that application, and only when they're satisfied with all that, grant the permits. So it's a process that can't be rushed, certainly in the early stages, but the more and more wells that are drilled and we demonstrate to the public that these are safe and we can operate these responsibly, then timescales will become quicker and more efficient. But at the moment, we have to go through this process, and it's a good thing for public concern that we are going through this, because it does give confidence that the regulators are doing their job and we're doing things responsibly.
Thanks. Does that echo at all with your experience, Ian?
Yeah, I mean, we were involved with a planning cycle in 2011 for some conventional wells, and we've been involved as a non-operator previously in similar applications, and that was a relatively straightforward process. Certainly, following on from that, with the shale gas wells, there's been a much greater focus, public focus, council focus on what is required, and from the council's point of view, what their job is. So what points that they, and I believe that Lancashire County Council have made a big progress in their understanding of the process, and as Leon says, it's been a slow process, and to a certain degree we're behind Cuadrilla in time, so we will be the beneficiaries of the pain that they've had, and the education process. But it's also true that there are other county councils, other mineral planning authorities across the country who will be looking on at this, and we had round tables today, from different groups, and they're not where Lancashire County Council are, because they haven't been through all this. Some of them are, in the East Midlands, there'll be councils in the Weald Basin, there'll be people who've had oil and gas applications before, but some aren't, and they're looking on thinking, do we have to learn all this? But I think the most recent planning guidance that's come out that says that a lot of the technical, the environmental side, the health and safety side, that the councils can accept that the regulatory bodies are a competent body, and the recommendations that they make can be followed, that the councils don't have to invent all this themselves. So that's going to help. It's going to take a number of applications before people are confident that the new guidance is working, but I'm confident that will happen.
It's very interesting. I wonder if I could just turn now to the issue of consultation. Obviously, in the planning and the permitting process, there is an argument that there should be some pre-consultation, and also during the process itself, some direct consultation with the authorities, but also the local communities. And maybe if I could just turn to Peter first to understand what it is in that consultation process that each side of the equation is really perhaps looking for?
Well, there was a book in the 60s called Fear of Flying by Erica Jong. I'm about to write another one called Fear of Fracking. I have given, by the end of next week, I'll have given 70 talks on various aspects of this, mostly to do with seismicity, but with shale gas and fracking in the round, to conferences like this, but many to local authorities, many to groups like women's institutes. I'm very Catholic in the groups I speak to, because there is a genuine lack of understanding, particularly in the public, but I suspect also amongst councillors, as to what this is all about. This is not something they've ever experienced before. They've not ever been asked to make decisions which they, the decisions mostly they've made are local infrastructure decisions, to make decisions which have such broad ramifications and are likely to inflame the passions of both local people and perhaps, let's say, people who take an interest in travelling to protest is very great. And so I am trying to go around and actually explain some of the evidence which I have gathered. I monitored the first fracking in England in 1988. It's quite a long time ago. The first fracking probably took place in Glasgow, certainly as early as 1964 and possibly earlier. So this is not as new a process as people believe. Okay, it has evolved, but in actual fact, many of the things, the pressures required to carry this out, are much the same. So I've been explaining the process. I've been trying to explain things like seismicity, things like, what are the threats to water supply? What are the threats to public amenity and visual amenities? But to be honest, it is that kind of communication. People need to be able to talk about it, to hear about it, and actually to ask awkward questions, if they like. And they expect those to be answered honestly and not with prevarication. I think it's quite difficult for the operators to actually occupy that space, to be perfectly honest. I think it behoves academics particularly to try to look at this objectively. This is not a trivial process. There are things we have learned in the last couple of years. We did not think that you could generate anything felt at the surface in terms of seismicity. We can. It turns out to be probably rather small, but we have to look at that, and we are actually there are still research questions to be answered there, and it is the role of people like the Tyndall Centre and people like myself to look objectively at these and try to produce that information not only for scientific purposes, but also in a form which people can understand in the general public.
I was just going to add to that. There's actually quite a job to be done, I think, for scientists generally in this industry to really almost to sort of recalibrate their communication strategies. With clients as well as public, we're finding ourselves increasingly, I think, as mouthpieces for the industry in various venues. And I'm certainly aware that there's a great challenge to try to discuss with lay people and particularly locals some of the quite technical, challenging subject matters that we need to deal with in terms of our impact assessments, for example. And certainly hydrogeology is not a simple science on the scales and the time frames that we're really considering for unconventional gas extraction for people really to understand and then to sort of accept. So, and then you add on top of that, I think, a lot of the uncertainty that is intrinsic within any mineral exploration. It's no different from any from a coal or conventional oil or gas scenario. There is still uncertainty, and there's learning on the job. Every hole that's drilled, every test that's done will slowly bring greater clarity and greater certainty on the performance and behaviour, environmental performance and behaviour of unconventional gas extraction. And these things can't be explained simply in a short time frame. I think these things are evolving, and people need to be part of the journey that we're taking as scientists, but be comfortable to come with us and not be quite so, I think, in opposition, which is currently, I think, the debate we're having.
So given you said that that's a sort of longer term developing process of consultation and education. Leon, what in a sort of early stage consultation process, what would you be looking at as sort of the measure of success of that consultation? Sort of maybe I could ask that to Leon maybe first. So how are you actually determining the value that you've gained through the process?
Well, to start off with, in terms of public consultation, we start off by holding workshops in the area, what we call public information days. Some of these are where we send several thousand letters out to local residents in the area. We also do radio, newspaper announcements, etc., to bring people to the village halls, where we've got the management team and technical experts to talk through some of the aspects of the operation, also information boards and videos and things like that. Even when we do all of that, we still unfortunately only get a low number of people through the door. You know, anything from kind of 30 people up to say 150 people all evening. Now there's two ways of looking at that. One is that people are not concerned, therefore they've not turned up. Others genuinely want to know more about the information that they've turned up, or something they've heard before and they're quite content to not attend again or learn the same facts again. So we hold a couple of these prior, give opportunities for people to attend. And the purpose of that is not to slam anyone with a 1,000-page document talking about the technical aspects of seismicity and all this sort of stuff that the layman, including myself to a degree, in some of the technical aspects can be quite complex. So we sit down and do myth busting, talk about the true facts and the way we're going to do this, and demonstrate that we're not going to destroy the environment and have Armageddon, etc., through doing this operation. We also then put the documents out through the local authorities and the permits and everything out for consultation. We remind people again over the radio and different aspects that these are out and the deadline is such a date, and encourage people to put any concerns forward that they've got. And once we get all those, then we take time to sit down and take all those comments on board and understand whether it's a material change is required to the permits to address such matters. So all the way through the process, we're engaging people, educating people through this, but we can only rely on people coming to the village halls when they've been invited to attend this. Obviously, it's very difficult. We can't go around 10,000 doors every time and knock on them and say, this is what we're doing. Please ask any questions. And as Mark was saying from DMV, it's all about perception. Depending on people's perception of what they've heard from the person in the pub or shopping centre or whatever it may be, that's the view they're going to have. And hopefully, if we can go to more public information sessions and we've done speeches as well at Women's Institute, National Farmers Union, etc., to hopefully spread that message and cause those ripples through the community. That's one aspect, but the true way of demonstrating this is safe is actually being operational, inviting people onto the site, showing them what we're doing, and at the end of it, say, that's it, we've done it. Look, no incidents, no problems, no concerns have been noticed. Unfortunately, we need to get the documents through and actually get operational to demonstrate that.
Okay, that's very interesting. Just kind of playing devil's advocate, in this whole process of planning and permitting and the various stakeholders and regulators involved, is it correct to say that the right level of information and detail, scientific and technical, is there at the right time for the decision makers? And maybe I could just address that to Richard, because I know you had some experience on an inquiry.
Very much so. I think there is definitely a reluctance to put too much too soon into the public domain, particularly because it's been mentioned there, there's a sense of obviously of overwhelming public and obviously regulators. But there's obviously a commercial sensitivity to a great deal of play, development, science. Some of it which will be shared publicly and be part of public debate at a higher level, but there's certainly an awful lot of commercially sensitive seismic data and certainly a large amount of therefore non-transparency with regard to the underground geological, and for my interest, hydrogeological, but certainly the geoscience is not as transparent as it would be in other planning regimes. So I think that will definitely invoke certain criticisms that there is a tendency to hide and not share that information for negative reasons and generate, I think, potentially a negative view in the public.
Okay. Do you have any experience in that area, Ian?
Well, I think that we would like to keep the communication around planning and things to do with the work that we're actually going to do on the site. I think that's the most important thing. Predominantly it's around surface amenity, so access and noise and traffic, and I think true planning considerations. And I think getting that information out at an early stage, once you have a site identified and you want to go for planning, then engaging early on those issues, because I think they are fundamentally the issues that people are concerned with. The wider issues around whether we should be having shale gas, whether we should, the more sort of political issues, I don't really think that the things that we would seek to engage on, what the energy policy of the country is, is a matter for elected representatives. And, we obviously we've had experience. I've had experience working in other parts of the world and different permitting regimes, different government concerns, and you go to other parts of the world, and maybe the government's focus on what they want is different. In parts of places I've worked previously, local content might be the key piece that an operator has to deliver. And sometimes in a big project, that's a very difficult thing to deliver. If there isn't local capacity for industry, etc. So, the government says, I want knowledge transfer, I want local content, and that's quite a high hurdle for operators to jump. But I think oil and gas operators, they will deliver what the government asks for, whether it's the local government or the central government. So the policies, the permitting requirements, the planning requirements, they are set by local and central government, and operators will deliver what that is as a minimum. And I think for the local engagement, the main concerns are around what is this at the surface.
I just wanted to get your views, going back to some points that have been a common theme today about perhaps a streamlining of the regulatory system. There's clearly a planning process and a general permitting process, and just as a general sort of view, are they working well together? Is it a twin track process? Do they converge, or are you finding they're running at sort of different timescales and it's difficult to operate within that framework? Maybe Leon, if you could give a view on that first.
Yeah, certainly. As I was saying before, the journey over the last 2 years has been to get to a stage where permits can be made parallel to the planning, so that when the public are looking at these documents, they're not looking at different things on different days and trying to understand what's going on in the system. We had a stage where we're issuing planning permissions, applying for those, then putting permits in the system, then doing different things, and obviously local stakeholders and the public are trying to keep track of all this, and suddenly getting a permit, does that relate to that planning application, etc. So we're working with the regulators, and certainly in the next process, when we submit the planning documents, we're going to be submitting the permits at the same time. So everything's in the system, it's transparent, people can cross-reference between the two and go through that process. And certainly our experience with the Environment Agency is moving towards a process which is streamlining that, so we're not duplicating the same information across several permits, but we are going for a standard rules approach where we can apply for 1, 2, 3 permits, whatever it may be, towards the end that contain the relevant information for them to make that decision. So where we're applying for several permits now and the planning, etc., you know, I can say that the regulators are working hard to streamline this. And this is not just to reduce the time that it takes for operators to get this, but also help the public understand what's going on in the system and read through the data. So our experience, you know, through this, it was a hard journey to start with, but we're certainly getting there now. And, you know, it will keep improving. You know, next year we're expecting the standard rules on hydraulic fracturing, etc. So we're getting the right foundations in place now to make sure that the process is as smooth as it possibly can be.
Peter, can I just ask you a question maybe on the environmental impact, environmental statement side? There's obviously a set of rules, regulations that are followed, but arguably there's a lot of information that is being provided by the same operator to different agencies to satisfy these different requirements. And what's your experience of that and your view of how that might be going forward?
Yes, well, it is quite difficult because on top of that, I guess we have now imposed a seismic regulation, which, if you like, came out of nowhere. So that's an additional hurdle. What does worry me slightly when we had the roundtable discussion before, because there seems to be a certain sector who are expressing a lack of confidence in the regulatory system in the UK. It has to be said that our system, in conjunction with the backing of the European regulations, it's difficult to see anywhere else in the world where we actually have as rigid a set of regulations. I presume it doesn't help if government actually does reduce budgets for regulators in the sort of environment we're looking to now. But I really find it hard to believe that there isn't an adequate level of regulation. How it's applied, and this continually going around loops between local authorities back to the Environment Agency, the Health and Safety Executive, potentially back to DEC. That is a spiral which sometimes seems to never end. And I think it sounds like Leon's got a bit of a feeling on that too.
If I can just add to that and use the Balcombe exploration site as an example. We applied for 2 environmental permits and, of course, the planning permission to be able to go down there and operate. As you're probably all aware, the opposition groups down there just, you know, made operations extremely difficult with a peak of kind of 1,500 protesters at any one time over the weekend of when we're actually operational. On a daily basis, the regulators were still very keen to come down and understand what we were doing and make sure we're in compliance with the permits. If you can imagine, we had local planning officers, environmental engineers from those people, noise assessment engineers, and also people from the Environment Agency wanting to come on site and look at the operations. Very easily, the regulators on the planning authorities could have said, look, the gates are closed, they're locked, we can't get in, we can't regulate on this day, we'll come back another time. But they didn't. They were adamant to come in. We managed to get them onto site safely. They went through robustly. And they did that on a few occasions down there to demonstrate that what we were doing was compliant with the permit. So it's not just about getting the permits and saying we've ticked the box, off we go now. It's the determination of the regulators to go in and demonstrate that they are regulating, and we can prove that that's happening under such circumstances was absolutely incredible. So when people say this industry is not regulated, I just find it so hard to believe how they've ever come to that conclusion.
Richard, in terms of your experience of particularly working on environmental impact assessments, environmental statements, do you think the sort of flow of information is duplicated and that process could be streamlined, or is it working efficiently?
Well, I've certainly identified a theme today that there's a need, I think, to identify what information is required when and by whom, and that technical, you know, within the regulatory, I suppose, regime, to understand where the technical authority exists and not to try and duplicate that authority. Certainly, I think local authorities, planning authorities, certainly have got a very, very tough task, I think, to achieve in managing applications and communicating those applications to their constituents, and be clear and transparent that they're being done, you know, adequately, and that the EIA process is being upheld. Because obviously the permitting regime requires a great deal of investment in regard to monitoring and obviously assessment of impact and assessment of risk particularly, and the response of those risks in terms of monitoring through the permitting regime. But also there's a great, as well as a legal requirement, obviously under the environmental impact assessment regulations, to identify significant impacts and to obviously quantify those and to identify appropriate mitigation, and also to look at obviously cumulative impacts in tandem with other developments. So there's I think naturally going to be some level of duplication, but I think there needs to be I think an understanding that to determine the likelihood of significance of impact for the purposes of planning potentially has a lower weight than would be necessarily required under permitting, where maybe a greater risk assessment and more detailed assessment would be appropriate. And under the planning regime, so long as those generic risks have been identified and then contextualized for the site-specific setting, particularly the noise, transport risks, air quality, the ones obviously which are more tangible to local residents, and to leave those which are slightly less tangible, the underground, certainly the seismic risks and hydrogeological concerns, water pollution concerns, which for fracking are going to be obviously a great deal of scientific judgment is going to be required. I think those, to be perfectly honest, are very difficult for local planning authorities to manage and communicate effectively with their planning committees or their constituents. So that's what I've learned, I think, to date.
Great, thank you. We've got some minutes now. I wondered if there are any questions from the audience to our speakers on this issue of the interface between the operator, the planning authority, and the regulator, particularly as I know we have some representatives from the Environment Agency, the Health and Safety Executive, or in general, just other questions around this area. Lady at the back.
Sue Slivich from RSK. We've been involved with DEC that's written a roadmap for the consents process, which is available on the DEC website. And the objective was really to clarify the processes that the operators are required to go through, and it's available for all to try and understand the process, and I would just draw your attention to it.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, perhaps if I could just turn to an issue that's not really been dealt with too much today. This issue of security, issue of policing. I know it's a great concern to those who are at this early stage of exploration activity. Just generally, what is the challenge and how can it be overcome in dealing with this on-site security issue in terms of the timescale of the projects and therefore enabling you to meet your commitments under the licenses? And if anything, what's the kind of long-term financial implication of all of this, or in your view, is it going to go away?
I think this is a red hot microphone.
Thank you. It's a very good question. We've not seen anything like Balcombe prior to that. And obviously since Balcombe, we've seen other operators suffer similar impacts from opposition groups. I mean, the two priorities for us in terms of opposition groups is the safety and well-being of obviously our own staff, getting into work and safely and returning each day, but also the local communities in the area. Because it can have quite a devastating impact on both of those. And when operators are working hard to build that trust and understanding with the local community, and then opposition groups do turn up, and generally some are peaceful. It's not to stereotype every protest or every opposition group. Everyone has the right to peaceful protest and to share their views. That's a human right. However, it's also a human right for people to be able to get into work, safely and securely without hassle at all. So it's just getting that balance right between the two. But however much we do in the community, I think there's still going to be an aspect of opposition groups wanting to come along and give their views. And they tend to tag on to where a community is in opposition. So if it's clear that if a planning or permit document or whatever it is goes into the system to look at new work, and the local community is not behind that, and they object and say we ourselves are going to protest against this, then the opposition groups from around the country tend to latch on to that and use that as the vehicle to get into the groups. But if we do the work right up front with the local communities and get them on side with it, or at least on a fence with it, to say as long as you do it responsibly, we're in support of it, and that's what we've got to aim for. Then opposition groups have nothing really to latch on to come to that area and protest against that. So I think we've got a long journey around that to understand that. But again, it goes back to demonstrating that we can do this safely and responsibly. And it's probably going to be tough for the first few wells that any operator does now over the next couple of years. But after that, same as radio, foam, masts, or whatever it was, there was protest activity against all of those, and now everybody uses mobile phone masts happily today, doesn't know they're there, forget they're there, and there's no protest activity against it. And that's where we want to hopefully get to going forward.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we're almost out of time. I think I'll take one more question if there is one. The gentleman at the back there.
Yeah, Tony Bosworth from Friends of the Earth. A question directly to Leon on what he's just said. If you don't think that opposition groups, as you call them, have a role in going to local communities and getting involved there, and you think that the protesting, you seem to be saying that the opposition should be something which local communities are doing. Do you also think that politicians and lobbyists should not be saying that shale gas and fracking should be happening in other areas and not in their constituency, and they should be sticking to talking about their own area as well?
I mean, there's different, obviously, views. There's different, political parties have different beliefs in terms of whether this will work, whether it won't work, what the benefits from this are going to be. Essentially, what we need to prove to everybody, whether it's the MPs, the parish councils, the residents, whatever it may be in those areas, and the farmers as well, whose land that we're using to do all of this, is we can do it safely. And I think the only way that we're going to get away from anybody that's got a sort of a NIMBY approach, or, I'm happy for this to happen, but not in my, back garden, etc. The only way is to show that we can do this safely. I mean, me personally, I've got HSSE. I'm going to go very close to my house. I'm not objecting to that, because as long as they can do it safely and responsibly, that's the main factor for me, and manage traffic movement and all that sort of thing. That's the important factor. So that's what we are doing with all of that. But obviously I can't speak for individual comments of politicians and their views. We're interested in the local community in the areas that we're operating.
Well, thank you very much for that. I think most of the panel will be around outside for the drinks afterwards if you have any more questions. I think it's really interesting to move down to this level and talk at the more operational perspective. So I hope that was very helpful. Thank you, Leon, Richard, Peter, and Ian. Thank you.
Hamish, thank you very much.